This video is the first of a new sub-series I'm beginning on this channel called Grail Stories. And I have about maybe 5 of these I think I'm going to do over the next few months. And in each, I'll pick one of my Elton grails from my collection and I'll share it with you. I'll explain what it is and why it's considered a grail, or why I consider it a grail. And of course, I'll explain how I ended up getting my copy. Now, I used the word grail recently when speaking with a friend of mine who collects different things, not records, but other things. And he wasn't too sure what I meant by grail. And maybe that's not a term that everyone would be familiar with. So before I get going, I'm just going to attempt my own definition of grail. You know, a definition specific to record collecting. So in record collecting, a grail is an item that's so rare and so coveted by collectors that it seems, and often is, unreachable. Unreachable because so few copies of that record were made originally, or maybe, you know, plenty of copies existed originally, but for whatever reason, very few copies survive today. And so often, not always, but often, the item will command a lot of money on the collector's market. To give a non-Elton example, think of the Beatles' Butcher album. It wasn't one of their UK albums, but it was one of their Capitol albums in the US and Canada, and was the first release in North America of many of those songs. And of course, there was the whole hullabaloo over the original cover design. And try getting one of those, these days. So that's definitely a grail. But that's part of the whole grail thing. Is the word grail has sort of a quest connotation to it. The idea of seeking something for what can turn out to be years and years, and never knowing, if you're ever going to find it. But if you do, when you do, it's more than just, a new item to add to your collection. In a way, it's kind of like a trophy. It represents your commitment to collecting that artist or band's work. And also, as a collector of that artist or band's work, it gives you a kind of distinction among other collectors. I don't like to think of collecting as a competitive thing, but it can be that way sometimes. So I have about 5 or so of these Elton grails to cover, and over time I'll make a video for each one, and I'll talk about what they are and what makes them a grail, and how I ended up getting my copy. And I'm starting big. My first one is possibly the biggest of any Elton grail I currently have. And it's a copy of Elton's first single, I've Been Loving You, which was a non-LP single released in March 1968. Elton got his first recording contract with Dick James in January of 1968, and according to the terms of that contract, there was the idea that he'd do, a couple singles a year. But since Dick James Music did not yet have its own label, the plan was to release these singles through the Philips label. So this single was released on Philips in March 1968. And right away, it's strange because that single lists the A-side, I've Been Loving You, as a John Taupin composition, when really Elton wrote the music and the lyrics for that song all by himself. He also single-handedly wrote the B-side, Here's to the Next Time, and was so credited on the label. Now, what I've been showing you on screen so far is not the version that I have with me here. I've been showing you on screen the UK version, which was a standard 2-song, 7-inch single, and I don't have one of those. UK copies are very rare, because after the single flopped, very quickly too, DJM just withdrew it. So it wasn't around for very long. So if this isn't a UK copy, then what is it? Well, this is the Portuguese version, the only other known stock version of the I've Been Loving You single released anywhere. And it's considered by some, including myself of course, to be even rarer than the UK version. Like the UK version, the Portuguese version was released on Blue Label Philips in 1968, and contain the songs I've Been Loving You and Here's the Next Time. But unlike the UK version, the Portuguese release had a picture sleeve. And instead of containing just 2 songs, A and B side, the Portuguese release was a 7-inch EP. It contained 4 songs, 2 per side. I've Been Loving You and Here's the Next Time on side 1, and Angel Tree and Thank You for All Your Loving on side 2. All 4 tracks play in dedicated mono, and all were produced by Caleb Quaye during the sessions now known to collectors as the Dick James demos, which took place at the small DJM Studios at 7175 New Oxford Street in London. These sessions, which began around November 1967 and lasted until about May 1968, are sometimes known as the Sgt. Zippo sessions. Now, why did DJM release this EP in Portugal, of all places? And the answer is, I have absolutely no idea. I won't even try to guess why. Of all potential foreign market territories, Dick James thought Portugal would be the most promising, or the only promising foreign market. I suppose we'll never know the answer to that. But then the next question is, why did DJM release it as an EP instead of as a conventional 2-song single like they did in the UK? That I think I can answer. 7-inch EPs, which almost always contained 4 songs a disc, came along in the early to mid 1950s. They had a bit of a market here in North America, but they proved much more commercially successful overseas, particularly in the UK and mainland Europe. And they were especially popular in Portugal. In fact, by the late 1960s, the 7-inch 4-song EP was, for pop music performers anyway, arguably the most popular of any vinyl format in Portugal at the time. And it wasn't unusual either for a pop music recording artist to make their first release in Portugal a 7-inch EP. And so obviously someone at DJM, or possibly it was at Philips, knew that the Portuguese release of I've Been Loving You should be an EP, and so would need 4 songs instead of just 2. Which then leads us to the next question. What makes this disc so special? Why is it a grail? Well, as I mentioned before, it was Elton's first single. And as I also mentioned before, of the 2 different stock versions of that single, only one had a picture sleeve, and it was the Portuguese version. This was also Elton's first 7-inch EP released anywhere. Not that his discography has many of those, but it has some, and this was the first. I should also mention that Philips pressed white label promo copies of this Portuguese EP. I don't know how many promos were made versus stock copies, and certainly the promo version is a grail too, but the stock version remains the bigger grail, if only because it came with the picture sleeve, and the promo version didn't. But what really makes this EP a grail is that it included the first release of a John Taupin composition anywhere, and that song was Angel Tree. Remember, despite the printed credits, Bernie Taupin did not really write the lyrics for I've Been Loving You. So neither of the first 2 songs on this EP were John Taupin songs. And as you can see, Elton co-wrote Thank You for All Your Loving with producer and occasional songwriting partner then, Caleb Quaye, not Bernie. So Angel Tree is really the first recording ever released of a John Taupin song, and that's landmark stuff. Now you may be wondering, well, we've had so many box sets and archival releases over the last 30 years. Surely those 4 tracks have long since been reissued. Well, yes and no. After 1968, I've Been Loving You and Here's the Next Time were never issued again on any format anywhere until 1992, when Bill Levinson of Polygram included them on the Rare Masters box set. But even then, the mixes on Rare Masters were stereo, not mono, and were remixes that Bill Levinson prepared special for that box set. They weren't vintage mixes. And since 1992, neither master version of I've Been Loving You or Here's the Next Time has ever reappeared on any compilation or archival release in any mix. So if you want to hear either recording in its original 1968 mono mix, you'll need either the UK 45 or this Portuguese EP. You won't find them anywhere else. Now what about the songs on side 2? Well, until just a few years ago, this Portuguese EP was the only legitimate release ever to feature either of these songs, Angel Tree and Thank You for All Your Loving, in any mix, mono or stereo. But then in 2020, the 8-CD Jewel Box collection finally included Thank You for All Your Loving, and in this same 1968 mono mix. But Jewel Box did not include the final arranged band version of Angel Tree that was originally released on this EP. It included instead an earlier version of Angel Tree that was kind of more like a demo. It wasn't until 2021 that the arranged band version of Angel Tree finally reappeared on the Sgt. Zippo album, which was released in June 2021 for Record Store Day. And the question then is, well, was the mix originally included on the Portuguese EP the same mono mix that we got in 2021 on the Mono Zippo LP? And the answer is yes. Now, I created a bit of suspense there because not long after Zippo finally came out, for a good while, I was convinced that they were very nearly but not completely identical. I was certain that the vocals were mixed slightly differently on the outro, specifically on the second round of La La La's just before the fade. But last night, I sort of A-B'd the two discs, the 1968 EP, which I try not to play too much because, it's not in great condition, versus the 2021 Mono Zippo LP. And I must have listened to that outro, on each disc about 20 times. I'm pretty certain now that the two mixes are the same. I think that perhaps why I thought that they were different at one point really has more to do with the sound quality of this Portuguese EP. It's not very good. It's very muffled. It's actually not that, it doesn't sound that much better than some of the Dick James demos bootlegs that turned up back in the 1990s, which had a couple of different mixes of Angel Tree on them. The 2021 release, Zippo, is so refreshingly clear that parts of those mixes will probably sound different to anyone, simply because we've not previously had the benefit of hearing what these mixes had to offer. Before I move on, something else that's kind of interesting. When Bill Levinson found the original multi-track session tapes of I've Been Loving You and Here's the Next Time in 1992, these were the tapes that he used to remix both songs in stereo for the Rare Masters box set. He remarked that at the original recording sessions, Here's to the Next Time was supposed to be the A-side, not the B-side, of that first single. I'm not sure if I've Been Loving You had even been written yet. Either way, it eventually became the single's A-side, obviously. And probably because it was just way more commercial sounding than Here's the Next Time. And I gotta admit, it may not be Funeral for a Friend, but I've always really kind of liked I've Been Loving You. It's one of my guilty pleasures, my Elton guilty pleasures. And, I know it's corny, but the chorus is just so catchy. And I remember when I heard it for the first time, when I got the Rare Masters box set in 92, I just did backflips. I played it over and over again. I loved it so much. Okay, now, here's maybe the biggest question of all. How the hell did I get one of these? I'd love to tell you that I was out crate digging, at a Salvation Army somewhere, or I was at a, flea market somewhere, and boom, there it was. But no, I found this on eBay. It was an eBay find. It's unglamorous, but true. I got it on eBay. But the real story for me, okay, the one that has meaning for me as far as Grail Quest goes, was that at the time I got it, I really wasn't in a position to spend a lot of money on records. I mean, I seldom am. I'm not a rich man. But this particular point, it was about 3 years ago, and I just returned from the United States to move back home to Canada. And long story short, I moved in with my parents. And when you live with your parents as an adult, it's important, or at least I felt it was important, to be very careful with money. You want your parents to see that you're being responsible with money. And anyway, one morning, I began to browse eBay. I think I had my laptop open. I was sitting at the kitchen table, and it was just lucky timing. I was doing some searches I hadn't done in a while, searches for early Elton singles, and lo and behold, one of these Portuguese EPs showed up in the search results, and it had been listed by a seller in California late the previous evening, California time. And I'd seen maybe one of these turn up on eBay just once before. Usually when people have something this rare to sell, they'll choose a bit more prestigious platform than eBay on which to sell it. But in this case, and I could see it right away, the copy wasn't in particularly great shape, and the price reflected that. So for a minute there, it seemed reachable. So I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, and this was just not long after breakfast, and my father had been through a couple times just after breakfast to refill his coffee or whatever. And a little later that morning, it's just before lunch, he comes back, and there I am, and I'm still sitting there staring at the eBay listing. And my dad must have seen it for the third or fourth time that morning, and he just finally said, what do you keep looking at on eBay? What is that? And so I tell him. Of course, I don't tell him at all that I'm just aching to get this thing. But he looks at me and he just asks, he goes, well, is it a fair price? And I tell him yes, and I explain the condition and everything. And he looks at me again, and he kind of shrugs, and he just says, well, why don't you get it? I was stunned. And he says to me, well, you're a big Elton fan. You've been since you were a kid. You're a serious collector. If I were you, I'd go ahead and I'd get that. And so with that encouragement, and thank you again, Dad, I got it. It wiped me out for almost the rest of the year in terms of record collecting budgets, but I got it. And I'm telling you, I've been an eBay user for nearly 25 years, and I've never had a more satisfying buy it now mouse click than when I got this. That felt really good. And the seller set it up here extremely well packaged, and in record time. It took less than a week to reach me here in Canada, even with customs clearance. Now, I didn't film my opening the box because I didn't know years ago that one day I'd have a YouTube channel like this, but I did take photos. So this is the box when it arrived. I'm opening it here. Popcorn and cheese doodles, I love those. Well packed. And here's the record itself. Again, very well packed. And there it is, in my hands for the first time. Okay, so not including last evening's Angel Tree-a-thon, I've played the disc only a few times. It's really scratchy, but despite its condition, this record is one of my Elton collection's centerpieces, and I'm just so thrilled to own this very rare piece of pop music history. Now, I mentioned earlier that Elton's discography doesn't include many 7-inch EPs, and that's very true, it doesn't. It has a few 12-inch EPs, well, actually really only one 12-inch EP that I can think of. It has some maxi singles, and throughout the 80s he released several double 7-inch singles, like 2 45s, one song per side, that kind of thing, in the UK. But there are a few other 7-inch EPs in his catalog. I can't spend much time talking about these, but I just want to show them very quickly. This first one is the 4 from Four Eyes EP, which was a DJM release, and it was released in 1977. It just has 4 songs on it: Your Song, Rocket Man, Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting, and, curiously, Whenever You're Ready We'll Go Steady Again, which is a non-LP B-side from Goodbye Elbrick Road. It's, it's not especially rare. It's not difficult to get a copy of this. This other example I want to show you is kind of rare. It is the 1973 US MCA Special Markets label, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, 4-song EP. It's almost like a sampler. And it was manufactured exclusively for jukeboxes. And on it we have Daniel, Teacher I Need You on side 1, and then on side 2 we have High Flying Bird and Crocodile Rock. And like I said, this is rare. So there are others in the catalog, some rare and some not very rare at all. I also want to show you this 45, which isn't an Elton John 45, but was released by a Canadian band called Wednesday. And it contains their cover version of I've Been Loving You, which they retitled Loving You Baby. And although they recorded it in late 75, they released the single in early 76, and it became a pretty big hit up here in Canada. In fact, it peaked on the Canadian charts in March of 1976, and that was right around the time that Elton and the second Elton John band, the Westies Band, were just arriving in Toronto to record Blue Moves. And I'm certain that they would have heard this on the radio play a couple times. How could they not have? It was a big hit up here. And anyway, I got this 45 from another Canadian collector of Elton, Gordon. I hope you don't mind that I say your name on this video. And hello, if you're watching, by the way. And that kind of makes it extra special to me because, Wednesday was a Canadian band, and, it's in the cover version of an Elton song, but I got it from another Canadian collector, that sort of thing. So this is special. So that's all I have to say for now about the 1968 I've Been Loving You Portuguese EP. But just a few last things before I go. First, I want to quickly acknowledge an article written by John Higgins. John Higgins, who was and remains a pioneering Eltonographer, and who published his article Treasures in the Vaults in the old East End Lights Elton John fanzine around the time that the Rare Masters box set was released. And it was in that article that Bill Levinson discussed all the tape research that he did for Rare Masters. And if it wasn't for that article, that John wrote based on that interview, we wouldn't have the information that we do about Bill Levinson and all the tape research he did for Rare Masters. And so thanks to John Higgins for doing that article, and thanks also to John Higgins for all the great feature stories that he publishes these days on eltonjohn.com. Also, in my last video I mentioned Blue Streak Records, which was my hometown record store. And it was just yesterday morning, actually, I realized that this Tuesday will be the 30th anniversary of my first ever purchase of any secondhand, records or CDs anywhere. And in that case, it was 4 Elton John LPs, which I bought on my first visit to Blue Streak Records on March 12th, 1994. And I remember exactly what I bought that day, 5 items, and of those 5 items, I still have 4, the exact copies that I bought that day. I also still have the original receipt from that purchase, my first purchase at Blue Streak Records. It's amazing that this survives because, when I was 13, I was not sentimental, I was not in the habit of saving things or anything like that, not yet. But it's through a small miracle this survived, and I was later able to make sure that I could preserve it. And anyway, I still do visit Peterborough from time to time, and when I do, I always stop in at Blue Streak and I always get something. So shout out to Blue Streak Records, my hometown record store. I'm a customer for life. And thanks also to you, my viewers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.